welcome. Our top focus today doesn't concern one specific African nation, but the entire continent as a whole. Reports say the Trump administration might be willing to eliminate operations in Africa drastically. And this shift in diplomatic priorities could soon reshape how America engages with the world's second largest continent. A draft executive order reportedly contains all of these details, and it is circulating behind closed doors at the White House. It lays out plans for an overhaul of the U.S. State Department, and Africa could directly feel the ripple effects as a result. According to this document cited in media reports, the move is a part of a cost-cutting strategy. It will aim to reduce spending for others while focusing on the priorities of the White House. The idea is to streamline operations of the State Department. One of the most notable changes, according to this plan, would be the elimination of the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs. In its place, the U.S. is reportedly planning to create a special envoy office for African affairs, but this will be done not within the State Department, but under the National Security Council. Instead of wide-ranging engagement through embassies, the focus would be to narrow down operations. The exact wording in the draft order says, and I quote, "All non-essential embassies or consulates in the sub-Saharan Africa region shall be closed. US's only focus in Africa will be on counterterrorism operations and trade of critical natural resources with countries." Now, this means that diplomacy could be more selective. Other State Department bureaus working on democracy, human rights, climate change, and refugee crisis could be shut. Now, these areas have long formed the foundation of America's soft power, which is its ability to influence through values, culture, and not by force. Scaling them back would mean shifting focus from long-term influence in favor of immediate goals. Some U.S. officials have raised concerns regarding this. They say it could be a complete step back from partnerships. Reports say that these changes will come by the 1st of October. If the draft comes official, the U.S. may remain present in Africa, but in a completely different way. Its approach would be more transactional and calculated. When the draft was first reported, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called it fake, but now it has been reviewed by other credible sources as well. The denial by America's top brass now seems more like a deflection. Now, for more on this, we have with us on the show Zaden Negatu, the geopolitical commentator, joining us live from Addis Ababa. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what would the geopolitical and the economic implications for African nations be if the U.S. significantly reduces its diplomatic presence and shuts down embassies and consulates across the continent?
Right. First of all, as always, it's great to be back on your program. And if you recall, I was on this program right after President Trump was inaugurated, and I made a comment that Africa actually always ranked very low on the priority list of the United States when the U.S. looks at its global sort of strategic importance. So there you usually have China, Europe, other parts of Asia, the Middle East, and if Africa was lucky, it would be down at the bottom of the list. So in terms of substance, I suppose, would much change by the closure of the embassies or the emphasis of Africa, even shutting down the African Bureau in the State Department? I'm not really sure. Yes, I think as Africans, as we would love to have the United States be present in every country. As you said, the soft power of the United States has served it very well. But I think we need to look at what President Trump is doing from a global perspective. He has a complete rethinking of what the U.S. priorities are, how the U.S. engages, whether it's Europe or China and other countries. So I don't want to look at it now an isolation, that this is just sort of a de-emphasis of Africa, or an approach that says,
Right.
well, we really may not need all of Africa. So we need to put that in context. However, and I think I'm in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia today. I'll be in Washington next week. But here at the headquarters of the African Union, where Ethiopia hosts the AU, and also happens to be the Horn of Africa. As you know, the Horn of Africa has always gotten a lot of disproportionate attention in Washington because of the one thing you mentioned in your intro, which is security for the United States. The Red Sea is a vital
Yeah.
outlet for what, a third of global oil and a third of global trade, a very significant amount. But still, the proposed embassy closures in Mogadishu, in Eritrea, in South Sudan. I mean, out of the sort of the five big embassies the U.S. has in this part of, the only one that'll be remaining is in Ethiopia and in Nairobi, and they have a small presence in Djibouti. So certainly in the Horn of Africa, there'll
Right.
be a very significant change when disclosures happen.
Big change. Right. And on that, how might the elimination of the State Department bureaus focusing on democracy, human rights, and of course refugee issues, how will this affect the US soft power? And how will it influence, it'll be a lack of influence in Africa, particularly in regions that are experiencing political instability or humanitarian crises?
Right. Very valid point that you're raising, because again, what's America's primary global interest? It's economic interest, right? So, as I said, if security in this part of Africa in particular, which the U.S. has been sort of the bulwark, or at least whether directly or by proxy. If you remember, interestingly, for example, in Somalia, the U.S. left in 1993 and re-engaged only a few years back, and now it's exiting again precisely because of security issues. It was engaged in Somalia. So across Africa, if I were me, even if the sort of the downgrading from the State Department, because the only part of the world that does not have a regional bureau in the State Department going forward, according to the documents you mentioned and others have mentioned, is Africa. It is now going to be subordinated within the National Security Council. Now, as I said, for Africans as well, we need to get very real, very serious about what is going on in the world. The U.S. will engage, and President Trump, as mentioned, he's a transactional leader. He says, what do we get out of Africa? So for Africa to get attention, even during the previous administration, during the Biden administration, a series of other administrations, uh, yes, there was a little pretending of, well, Africa is important, we'll engage it. But the reality is, if you look at it, the U.S. gave more aid than it did investments in Africa, even under Democratic administration. So I think what President Trump is saying is, let's be real. Our interest is economic. What does Africa have to offer? I just read some report, for example, they are engaging with DRC, okay, directly, because of the significant natural resource DRC. Many African countries, if they were to get attention in Africa, even if they don't have resources, they can't elevate their economic activity, their trade with the United States, and they might get their fair share of attention. But the fact of the matter is, Africa has to prepare for a completely different view of the world by President Trump and people in Washington. And Africa, I'm sorry to say, will continue to be now even less focused in Washington unless it elevates its game. If we don't trade, why would the United States care about Africa? I mean, let's be real. I mean, that's what President Trump is saying. Why would I waste my time when
Right.
Africa accounts for less than 2% of America's global trade? So the security part of it, I think,
Yes.
can be handled even without having an embassies.
Right. But in the context of rising global competition for influence in Africa, especially from countries like Russia and China, what strategic risks does the US possibly face by pulling back diplomatically and developmentally from the continent?
Right. So listen, again, you have to read between the lines or some of the details where the embassies will be closed, where the emphasis will happen. In the countries where China has, or less so Russia, but China has very significant presence and continue to be, for China had to be, the countries like Ethiopia, like South Africa, or even Nigeria, to a certain extent, Kenya, the US will continue to have a presence. Okay? And so the counter, and by the way, the US has its only base in Africa right next to Ethiopia here in Djibouti. It's a small country, but the interest is to protect the bigger, that as I said, that sea lane, but also to be continuously engaged because they have a huge interest in Ethiopia, for example. I mean, it's a very big country. It's the second most popular. In Nigeria, the same thing. You know, Alyson, look, America's overall oil trade with the United States is less than $75 billion a year. That's less than what one big American multinational company generates in revenue per year. This is all of 54 countries combined. So again, I'll go back to my earlier point. You want to get attention in Washington? Elevate your game, elevate your economic activity. That's what will interest President Trump and the Trump administration. Yeah. But in terms of, you know, the Chinese, yes, the U.S. priority, as I said right now, China, 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 right? So the U.S. is not pulling out of countries where the U.S. thinks China has very significant interest, and the U.S. will have very big significant interest in the future. So it's not pulling out of those countries. It's not de-emphasizing those countries. But all Africa is not a priority. I mean, I think that's the bottom line.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for being with us on First Post Africa. As always, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Greeting you with aloha and namaste.
No, I love India.
Presence, occupation of a territory by another country pertains to India, what we saw in Kashmir.
How do you see Trump's America?
Yes, the current administration behaves differently from the previous administration.
Are you saying that there are foreign powers who are trying to bring down the current government in Syria?
Exactly.
Iran, maybe Russia too.
Prime Minister Modi committed to South-South, cooperation.
For both sides.
Not over 50%. Is Ukraine prepared to pay the price for that peace?
No compromises at the cost of territorial integrity and sovereignty.